the 1960s is known for many things, like flower power, greater equality for women, the first moon landing, and the birth of the civil rights movement. But the biggest event that dominated the decade was a war in the small country of Vietnam. The Vietnam War is recognised as one of the longest major battles, where approximately 60,000 Australians were involved in the 20th century. Australia's involvement in the war can never be told without diving into the complex political web that drew Australia into the battle. In 1965, Australia's Prime Minister Sir Robert Menzies committed troops to the Vietnam War, with a goal to prevent the communist North Vietnamese from invading South Vietnam. There were many reasons for Australia's involvement in the war, one of the main ones being fear of communist expansion in Asia. Menzies believed in the domino effect, meaning that if one country in a region became communist, the other countries would then follow, destroying Western society of capitalism and democracy. Another motivation for involvement was out of allegiance to the United States for their World War II support. He wanted to keep on side with America and maintain healthy foreign relationships. Australia's initial involvement in the war was a low-key affair, and it began in July of 1962 with the deployment of 30 advisors called the AATTV, Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, to assist the US forces in jungle warfare training. Over the next 10 years, Australia's involvement increased. In early 1965, South Vietnam could not hold off the North Vietnamese comrades and Viet Cong for long, so the US commenced a major increase of the war by adding 200,000 troops to the conflict. They requested support from other countries, so on the 29th of April 1965, Prime Minister Menzies dispatched the 1st Australian Battalion. However, in March of 1966, the Australian government decided that they wanted Australia's involvement to be both stronger and more noticeable, so they dispatched a second task force with 2 more battalions and support from the local Phuc Toi services. One of the deadliest battles fought by Australia was the Battle of Long Tan on the 18th of August 1966, where around 100 Australian soldiers fought an enemy force of 2,000 and held them off until reinforcements came. At the beginning of the conflict, most of Australia paid little attention to the war that involved a few training army soldiers. However, as news broke that Australia was going to be involved in Vietnam, anti-war groups broke out, and Australia actually favoured not going to Vietnam. Vietnam was televised, so the public saw the true brutality of the war, and conscription of young men, known as the birthday lottery, also caused outrage in Australia. As casualties started to mount, Prime Minister McMahon announced in August of 1971 that troops were actually going to be withdrawn. Nobody has a better grasp on the role of an Australian soldier at the war than a soldier themselves. My Uncle Phil was one of the many young Australians who served in the Vietnam War. I sat down and interviewed him so I could find out more about the human side of Australia's involvement in the war. Uncle Phil served from 1967 to 1968 as an infantry rifleman forward scout at Long Tan. He said his initial reaction to landing in South Vietnam was the shock of the heat and humidity. He said that it felt like he'd been hit with a blowtorch.
While in Vietnam, Uncle Phil spoke about how the Australian soldiers fought in the harshest of conditions.
So, not only did they have to contend with the dense Vietnamese jungle and monsoonal rains, but they were facing an enemy that was familiar with these conditions.
The Vietnam War was a brutal conflict for those serving. But despite this, Uncle Phil shared some light-hearted stories with me about life as an Australian soldier. One story involved the wildlife in the country.
One day at the camp, he saw a bunch of soldiers running out from one of the tents, yelling, "A bloody big snake just came into the tent." He told me that the big brave soldiers weren't game to spend the night in the tent with the snake. So they returned the next morning with their rifles and filled the king cobra snake with a few holes.
The land was as dangerous an enemy as the actual war itself.
Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War raged on for 10 years, leaving 521 soldiers dead and 3,000 wounded. Australia's involvement in this war will forever be remembered for the division and controversy it caused our country, both socially and politically. Today, Australia recognises their sacrifices, but it hasn't always been this way. They were greeted with a hostile and unappreciative Australia when they returned home. And then there are the long-term mental and physical health consequences for the Vietnam veterans.
Uncle Phil said that his time in Vietnam provided him with opportunities to make lifelong friends, but like so many other Australians, it also affected his mental health.
A lot of the grief from this war lay in the past, and even though things might have ended in Vietnam, many still carry the physical and emotional scars from their service 50 years later. Bearing the burden of serving in the war also negatively affects their families too. So, in many ways, Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War is not over yet, and it will continue for the rest of their lives.